Most ancient civilizations tell a story about how they began. The Sumerians told a story about what came before them, not as myth, not as poetry, but as record in the oldest tablets ever pressed into clay. The first human kings do not claim to invent their world. They do not describe a struggle to civilize chaos or the slow rise of knowledge from ignorance. They describe something far stranger. They say they inherited it. Long before human rule, according to these records, the world was already measured, already governed, already ordered. Cities had names, authority had structure, law had precedent, and then something ended. The texts never linger on that ending. They mark it with a single, almost administrative line. The flood swept over, and after that moment, everything that followed was smaller, shorter lives, weaker kings, fragmented knowledge. Civilization did not begin after the catastrophe. It resumed. That alone should unsettle what we think we know about our own origins. Because if the earliest civilization did not see itself as the beginning, then what exactly were they remembering? The question becomes unavoidable when you read the tone of the tablets themselves. They do not sound like stories told to inspire faith. They sound like archives maintained by people afraid of forgetting. In the 19th century, when European archaeologists first uncovered the libraries of ancient Mesopotamia, they expected to find mythology, symbolic tales of gods and heroes, poetic explanations for the natural world. Instead, they found lists. King lists, city lists, reign lengths measured in years so vast they strain comprehension. One document, now known as the Sumerian king list, begins with a sentence so calm and so matter-of-fact that its implications are easy to miss. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, not created, not claimed, descended. The word is precise. Kingship, as an institution, existed somewhere else before humans held it. The list then records 8 rulers who governed before a great flood. Their reigns lasted not decades, not centuries, but tens of thousands of years. 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. No explanation is offered, no divine spectacle, no justification, just numbers, written in the same accounting style used for tracking grain and livestock. Then comes the flood. After that line, everything changes. Kingship descends again, but now to humans. Reign lengths collapse into human scale. The tone becomes recognizably historical. Something had been lost. For decades, scholars tried to explain these early reigns away. Symbolism, they argued, astronomical cycles, dynastic totals compressed into single names. But the scribes who wrote these tablets did not treat them as metaphor. They copied them faithfully across centuries, placing them in temple archives, referencing them in legal disputes, and preserving them alongside documents that we can independently verify as historical fact. To dismiss them entirely requires assuming that the earliest record keepers in human history were careless with truth, but meticulous with bookkeeping. That assumption does not sit easily with the evidence. When archaeologists excavated the cities named in the king list, Eridu, Uruk, Shuruppak, they found something equally troubling. Beneath layers of later construction lay clean strata of flood-deposited silt. Not gradual flooding, not seasonal overflow, a sudden, violent inundation that buried entire settlements. At Leonard Woolley uncovered an 11-foot layer of sterile sediment, separating 2 distinct phases of habitation. Above it, civilization continued. Below it, an older world ended. Woolley famously announced, "We have found the flood." His claim was dramatic, perhaps too dramatic, but the stratigraphy was real, and the tablets had been saying this all along. The flood was not myth, it was memory. But here is where the story becomes even more unsettling. The cities rebuilt after the flood were not primitive restarts. They re-emerged with advanced mathematics, complex irrigation systems, astronomical calendars, legal codes, and a fully developed writing system. There is no visible learning curve. Writing appears not as crude pictographs slowly evolving into language, but as a complete system capable of recording law, medicine, and planetary motion. Mathematics arrives fully formed in base 6.0, the same system we still use to measure time and angles. Astronomy shows precise knowledge of planetary cycles that require centuries of observation. None of this looks like invention. It looks like reconstruction. In temple inscriptions written centuries after the flood, Sumerian kings repeatedly described their greatest achievements with the same phrase, "I restored it as it was in ancient days." Not improved, not redesigned, restored. The implication is subtle, but profound. There was an original template, and it did not belong to them. To understand who they believed had established that original order, we have to look at the names that appear again and again in the earliest texts. Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag. Later traditions would call them gods. But in the oldest Sumerian sources, they are something else. They are administrators. They allocate cities. They regulate water. They decree laws. They establish calendars. They assign domains. They are collectively called the Anunnaki. And in the earliest records, the Anunnaki do not create the world. They govern it. They are described not with reverence, but with bureaucratic familiarity. They meet in councils. They issue decisions. They enforce boundaries. One legal tablet from Lagash records a mundane dispute over irrigation rights between two temple estates. The judgment ends with a single line. The Anunnaki have made this decision binding, not as divine punishment, not as supernatural intervention, as final authority. This is how the Anunnaki appear across the oldest layers of Mesopotamian writing, not as distant cosmic beings, but as present rulers whose jurisdiction was once unquestioned. Then, after the flood, they withdraw. They are not overthrown. They are not destroyed. They simply stop ruling directly. Human kings take their place, ruling cities that already exist, enforcing laws they did not write, maintaining systems they believe were given to them. The world continues, but under diminished conditions. Shorter lives, fragmented knowledge, constant rebuilding. The Sumerians never described this transition as progress. They described it as survival. And if that is true, if humanity inherited a world once governed by others, then the oldest question in human history is not how civilization began, it is what ended before it, and why the memory of that ending still echoes in the clay. They did not speak of the Anunnaki as distant ancestors. They spoke of them as predecessors. This distinction matters more than it first appears. In later mythologies, gods exist outside time. They create, they destroy, they vanish into abstraction. But in the earliest Sumerian records, the Anunnaki are firmly embedded inside time. They arrive, they rule, they depart. And their departure is treated not as a mystery, but as a consequence. One tablet describes a moment of tension among them. The lesser gods grow weary of labor. The burden of maintaining the world becomes too great. A decision is made in council. Humanity is created, or, as some translations suggest, reconfigured to assume the work. This is not a story of sudden creation from nothing. It is a story of delegation. The Anunnaki do not disappear because they are defeated. They withdraw because their system changes. Power transfers downward. Responsibility shifts. The world remains, but its caretakers are different. What is unsettling is not the myth itself. It is how closely this pattern aligns with what we see archaeologically. After the flood layers, the material record shows continuity with loss. Tools remain similar, but craftsmanship declines. City plans persist, but maintenance becomes inconsistent. Astronomical knowledge continues, but fewer texts preserve it. It is as if a complex system lost its specialists, leaving behind instructions that were only partially understood. This is how technological collapse works in every era, not through sudden ignorance, but through missing context. A machine can be maintained for generations without anyone fully understanding how it was designed, until it breaks. In Sumerian literature, There is a persistent anxiety about this fragility. Kings boast not of innovation, but of preservation. They emphasize how carefully they followed divine instructions, how closely they adhered to ancient measurements, how faithfully they rebuilt temples according to forgotten plans. Deviation was not celebrated. It was feared. One inscription warns that altering the dimensions of a sacred structure could disrupt cosmic order. Another describes famine as the result of misaligned rituals. These are not superstitions in the modern sense. They are symptoms of dependence. When a system is inherited rather than invented, obedience becomes survival. Over time, this dependence transforms into reverence. The Anunnaki slowly become gods, not because their nature changes, but because human understanding does. Authority, once practical, becomes symbolic. Administration becomes theology, and memory becomes myth. This process is visible not only in Mesopotamia. Similar patterns appear across early civilizations. In Egypt, the earliest pharaohs are described as intermediaries between gods and humans, maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order that already exists. In Mesoamerica, the first cities are attributed to divine planners whose knowledge cannot be replicated. In the Andes, stonework reaches a level of precision later cultures struggle to match, accompanied by legends of teacher gods who depart across the sea. Each culture frames the story differently, but the structure repeats: a time of higher order, a rupture, a diminished continuation. What changes is the explanation. Some cultures emphasize moral failure. Others emphasize cosmic cycles. Others blame natural catastrophe. But beneath these narratives lies a shared admission. The world we inherited was not designed by us. This does not require believing the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrials, as some modern interpretations suggest. It requires acknowledging something more subtle, that early humans perceived themselves as successors, not originators. And perception shapes behavior. When people believe they are rebuilding rather than inventing, they act conservatively. They copy. They preserve. They hesitate to alter. Innovation slows. Stability becomes the goal. This may explain one of the most puzzling features of early history: the long plateaus. For thousands of years, technology advances only marginally. Stone tools remain unchanged. Architectural styles persist with little variation. Agricultural methods stabilize. Then, suddenly, innovation accelerates. Bronze metallurgy spreads rapidly. Writing evolves. Empires form. What changed? Perhaps not intelligence. Perhaps confidence. The moment humanity stops seeing itself as caretaker of a lost system and starts seeing itself as author of a new one. This shift is visible in later Mesopotamian texts. By the time of Hammurabi, kings claim divine sanction, but they also claim authorship. They issue laws in their own names. They innovate. They expand. The gods still matter, but they no longer govern directly. The Anunnaki fade further into abstraction. Their names persist, but their functions dissolve. Yet even in these later periods, the anxiety never fully disappears. Flood myths continue to be copied. Warnings about celestial omens remain central to statecraft. Astronomy becomes increasingly important not just for calendars, but for reassurance. The sky must be watched. Because the last time it changed, everything else followed. This vigilance suggests unresolved memory, not of events, but of vulnerability. The Sumerians may not have known exactly what ended the previous world, but they knew enough to fear recurrence. This fear shaped their institutions. They invested heavily in divination. They trained specialists to read the stars. They tracked eclipses and planetary alignments obsessively, not out of curiosity, out of caution. If the Anunnaki once ruled from the heavens, or were at least associated with them, then the sky was not neutral. It was active. It could intervene. One omen text describes a configuration of planets as the return of former order. Another warns that certain alignments signal the opening of ancient gates. These phrases are ambiguous. They could be symbolic. They could be metaphorical, but they also suggest anticipation, as if something expected had not yet occurred, as if humanity was waiting. Over time, waiting becomes ritualized. Ritual becomes tradition. Tradition becomes religion, and the original reason for waiting fades. What remains is reverence without context. This is how inherited systems finally become myths. Not because they are false, but because they are no longer fully understood. And yet, fragments persist. In architecture that seems over-engineered, in calendars that track cycles longer than a human lifespan, in myths that speak of return rather than creation, these fragments raise an uncomfortable possibility that humanity did not emerge into an empty world, but into one already shaped by rules it did not set. And if that is true, then the question is not whether the Anunnaki were real in the way modern imagination demands. The question is simpler. What kind of world requires its successors to spend millennia remembering rather than inventing? And what happens when memory finally fails? Because when memory fails, patterns repeat without understanding, and history does not announce itself when it begins again. It only leaves signs afterward, signs pressed into clay, buried beneath silt, waiting to be read by those who no longer remember why they were written. There is a quiet detail in the Sumerian record that rarely draws attention. It appears not in myths, but in lists. Lists of kings, lists of reigns, lists of years. The earliest king lists describe rulers who reigned for impossibly long spans of time, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of centuries. Modern scholars usually interpret this as symbolic exaggeration, a way of honoring the distant past. But the text itself makes a distinction. Before the flood, reigns are vast and immeasurable. After the flood, reigns become human. This transition is not explained. It is simply stated. The kingship descended from heaven, one line reads, and after the flood, it descended again. The phrasing is careful. Kingship does not emerge. It descends. Authority is not created. It is transferred. And it happens more than once. This suggests a world structured by phases, not evolution, but succession. If the Anunnaki were merely mythological gods, this language would be unnecessary. Myths usually glorify origins. These texts emphasize continuity. Something existed before, something ended, something resumed, changed. The flood, in this context, is not only a natural disaster, it is an interruption, a reset point. And what is most revealing is what happens immediately afterward. The texts do not describe chaos. They describe rebuilding. Cities are named again. Temples are restored. Kingship is reassigned. This implies knowledge survived. Plans survived. Only the executors changed. Archaeology supports this uneasily well. In southern Mesopotamia, the earliest post-flood layers show rapid reorganization. Irrigation systems appear almost immediately. Urban planning resumes with recognizable layouts. Writing emerges not tentatively, but fully formed. This is one of the most persistent puzzles in human history. Writing does not gradually evolve from scratches to symbols. It arrives complex, structured, standardized. The earliest cuneiform tablets already assume a literate bureaucracy. They are records of accounting, ownership, and administration, not experimentation. This suggests that writing did not begin as invention. It began as recovery, as if knowledge existed in another form before being re-expressed. The Sumerians themselves hint at this. They describe sacred knowledge as divine ordinances governing every aspect of civilization. Kings do not create the they receive them. Each governs a function: kingship, craftsmanship, law, music, architecture. Together, they form a complete operating system for society. The gods distribute them. Humans implement them. When Inanna steals the in one myth, she does not invent chaos. She redistributes capabilities. Civilization shifts location, not structure. This reinforces a troubling idea. That early civilization did not arise organically from human experimentation. It was assembled from pre-existing components, whether those components were literal technologies, social blueprints, or symbolic memory is debated. But the framework is consistent. Humanity steps into a role already defined. This framing changes how we interpret early progress. Instead of asking how humans advanced so quickly, we might ask why they advanced so conservatively. Why did innovation plateau for so long? Why did monumental architecture persist with minimal variation? Why were religious rituals repeated with obsessive precision? Because deviation carried risk. When a system is inherited without full understanding, alteration becomes dangerous. This anxiety is visible in how early societies treated mistakes. Errors were not corrected experimentally. They were feared as omens. A failed harvest was not an agricultural problem. It was a cosmic one, misalignment with a deeper order. This worldview only makes sense if the order itself predates the people maintaining it. Over centuries, as direct memory faded, metaphors took over. The Anunnaki became distant gods. Their instructions became commandments. Their presence became symbolic. But symbols preserve shape even when substance is lost. This is why myths across cultures echo similar patterns. A golden age, a catastrophe, a diminished continuation. These stories persist because they encode something structural, not a single event, but a relationship between humans and a world they did not fully design. The unsettling implication is not that advanced beings once ruled Earth. It is that humanity may have inherited complexity before it earned understanding. And that inheritance shaped our psychology. We learned obedience before innovation, preservation before exploration, stability before curiosity. Only when memory of the former order finally thinned did creativity accelerate. And with it came new risks, new collapses, new resets. If this pattern is real, then the Sumerian record is not a fantasy about gods. It is a reflection on stewardship, on what happens when caretakers replace architects, on how long a system can endure without its original designers, and on the quiet fear that lingers long after the designers are gone, the fear that something essential has been forgotten, and that the forgetting itself may be cyclical. Because if humanity once inherited a world shaped by others, then the question is no longer about the Anunnaki. It is about us. What happens when we become the predecessors, and who will inherit what we leave behind? There is a subtle shift that occurs when a civilization stops believing it is the first. The tone of its stories changes. Confidence gives way to caution. Discovery gives way to preservation. Creation becomes restoration. In the Sumerian worldview, humanity does not stand at the beginning of time. It stands somewhere in the middle. This alone separates their perspective from most modern narratives. Today, progress is imagined as a straight line forward. For the Sumerians, history bends. They describe cycles where knowledge rises, falls, and returns altered. The word for ancient, in their language, does not mean primitive. It means closer to the source, closer to authority, closer to truth. This is why the most sacred knowledge is always the oldest. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as innovators in the human sense. They are custodians, managers of systems already in motion. Even their conflicts are administrative rather than emotional. They debate jurisdiction. They argue over territories. They negotiate responsibility. This is not the behavior of abstract gods. It is the behavior of overseers. And when their presence recedes, what follows is not liberation. It is uncertainty. The post-Anunnaki world is filled with rituals meant to maintain alignment. Priests observe the sky obsessively. Astronomical records are kept not for curiosity, but for stability. If the heavens shift, society adjusts. If the heavens repeat, society relaxes. This dependence suggests the sky was once more than a calendar. It was a reference point, a control surface. The Sumerians believed that order flowed downward from the heavens. to the gods, to kings, to people. If the top layer changed, everything below it destabilized. This belief may explain the fixation on celestial anomalies. Comets were not curiosities, they were warnings. Eclipses were not spectacles, they were audits. Even planetary movements were read as signals of approval or disapproval. Modern science interprets this as superstition, but superstition usually forms around fear. This system forms around expectation, as if the sky had once actively communicated, and silence was not the norm. There is also an absence worth noting. The Sumerian texts do not dwell on rebellion against the gods. Humans do not overthrow the Anunnaki. They do not escape them. They endure their absence. This implies dependency, not oppression. The relationship was not framed as captivity. It was framed as guidance, which makes its disappearance more destabilizing than liberating. Archaeologically, this period aligns with sudden diversification. Once centralized templates weaken, variation emerges, cultures branch. Local gods appear, practices diverge. This looks like freedom, but it is also fragmentation. Without a shared reference system, coherence fades. Civilizations begin to rise and fall independently. Progress accelerates, but so does collapse. This pattern repeats across continents. In Egypt, divine kingship slowly transforms into symbolic authority. In the Indus Valley, standardized systems dissolve mysteriously. In Mesoamerica, calendars reset after cycles of destruction. Different cultures, same rhythm, rise, stability, loss of alignment, reset. What ties these together is not contact, it is inheritance. Each culture behaves like a caretaker of something ancient, something powerful, something not fully understood. And as generations pass, instructions turn into traditions. Traditions turn into myths. Myths turn into metaphors. And metaphors eventually lose their original function. This is where danger enters. When a system continues to operate without understanding its purpose, mistakes compound, rituals become empty, symbols lose calibration, warnings are misread, and collapse becomes inevitable. The Sumerian flood story reflects this moment precisely. It is not framed as punishment. It is framed as correction, a return to baseline. Afterward, humanity resumes, but smaller, shorter-lived, more fragile. The texts even note this explicitly. Human lifespans decrease dramatically. Authority fragments. The gods withdraw further. If taken literally, this suggests biological change. If taken symbolically, it suggests psychological change. Either way, humanity is diminished, not destroyed, reduced, which raises a difficult question. If the Anunnaki were not creators, but predecessors, and if humanity inherited systems beyond its original design, then what phase are we in now? Because modern civilization mirrors the late-stage pattern. Technology accelerates faster than understanding. Systems grow more complex than oversight. Warnings are observed, but deferred. We treat anomalies as curiosities, not signals. We preserve rituals without questioning origins. And we assume continuity is guaranteed. The Sumerian record does not share this confidence. It assumes impermanence, not as tragedy, but as process. What unsettles modern readers is not the presence of ancient gods. It is the implication that civilizations can outlive their understanding, and that collapse is not always sudden. Sometimes it is quiet, gradual, marked by forgetting rather than catastrophe. If humanity once inherited a world shaped by others, then inheritance itself becomes a responsibility, not to repeat, but to understand, because caretakers who never become architects eventually lose the blueprint. And when that happens, systems fail in ways that feel mysterious, unfair, sudden, but were always unfolding. The Sumerians seemed to know this. They did not record history to celebrate themselves. They recorded it to remember what came before, and to warn what comes after. Not through fear, but through pattern. Because patterns persist long after names are forgotten. And inheritance, once begun, does not end. It only changes hands. There is a moment in every inherited system when maintenance quietly becomes imitation. The actions continue. The forms remain intact, but the reason behind them thins. In the Sumerian texts, this moment is marked not by disaster, but by repetition. Rituals are performed exactly as prescribed. Cities are rebuilt according to ancient measurements. Kings swear the same oaths, using the same words, facing the same directions. Yet something subtle changes. The texts begin to explain why the rituals are done. Earlier records simply state that they are done. Explanation appears only when understanding begins to fade. This is an important distinction. Knowledge that is alive does not explain itself. Knowledge that is decaying begins to justify. By the later periods of Sumerian writing, priests no longer assume divine alignment. They monitor it. They calculate. They cross-check. They worry. Astronomical observations grow more detailed, not less. As if precision has replaced certainty, the sky is watched more closely because it is trusted less. This shift may explain why celestial records become so obsessive. Star catalogs, planetary tables, omen lists stretching for hundreds of tablets. These are not the records of wonder. They are the records of vigilance. As if something once reliable had become unpredictable. And unpredictability is dangerous when your civilization depends on alignment. There is another detail often overlooked. The Anunnaki are rarely described as present during these later centuries. They are invoked, remembered, appealed to, but not encountered. Communication has become indirect, mediated through signs, through dreams, through omens. This is what communication looks like after departure. When guidance becomes interpretation, and interpretation multiplies error, in this environment, power shifts. Kings begin claiming divine authority rather than stewardship. Where once kingship descended from heaven, now kings declare themselves chosen. This is a fundamental inversion. Authority no longer flows downward. It is asserted upward. This inversion destabilizes everything. Because systems inherited require humility, systems claimed require dominance. The difference is subtle, but consequential, and it may explain why collapse accelerates after this point. Not immediately, but inevitably. Civilizations persist. They flourish. They build. But they do so atop misaligned foundations. Foundations laid by others, maintained by ritual, modified by assumption, until stress reveals weakness. In the archaeological record, this appears as abrupt abandonment. Cities emptied without signs of war. Monuments left unfinished. Administrative systems collapsing while culture persists. These are not signs of conquest. They are signs of internal failure, as if the operating conditions changed, or the system exceeded tolerances, or maintenance alone was no longer sufficient. The Sumerians never describe the final cause. They only record the outcome. And then they stop, which may be the most telling detail of all. The civilization that documented everything stopped documenting, not because writing vanished, but because continuity did. Later cultures inherit fragments. Akkadians translate Sumerian texts, but no longer fully understand them. Babylonians preserve myths, but reinterpret meanings. Assyrians copy tablets as relics. Each generation moves further from the source, closer to symbol, farther from function. This process does not erase the Anunnaki. It abstracts them. They become archetypes, forces, metaphors. Eventually, they become indistinguishable from imagination, which is convenient because imagination does not demand responsibility. But if the Anunnaki were ever real in any sense, biological, technological, or symbolic, then abstraction is not progress. It is loss. The loss of specificity, the loss of accountability, and the loss of warning. Because warnings encoded in metaphor are easy to ignore. They can be reinterpreted, deferred, spiritualized. But warnings encoded in systems cannot be dismissed. They either function or they fail, and failure is unforgiving. Modern civilization exhibits a familiar pattern. We inherit infrastructures we did not design, technologies we do not fully understand, systems so complex no individual comprehends them entirely. We maintain them, we optimize them, but rarely do we question their foundational assumptions. Like the Sumerians, we record obsessively. Data replaces omen, models replace myth, but the behavior is the same. We watch for deviation, we fear disruption, we assume continuity, and we explain anomalies away. This parallel is uncomfortable because it suggests we are not unique. We are late-stage inheritors, caretakers of a world shaped by prior processes. Whether those processes were human, non-human, or emergent does not change the lesson. Inheritance carries risk, especially when confidence outpaces comprehension. The Sumerians did not leave us answers. They left patterns. And patterns do not speak loudly. They repeat, quietly, across time, across cultures, across collapses. If humanity once inherited a world shaped by others, then forgetting may not be our greatest danger. Misunderstanding may be, because what we misinterpret, we eventually misuse. And what we misuse, we eventually lose. The Anunnaki, in this reading, are not the center of the story. They are the beginning of a question that never resolved. What happens when intelligence inherits complexity without context? How long can stewardship substitute for understanding? And when the next transition arrives, not announced, not dramatic, but subtle, will we recognize it as a warning or only as an inconvenience? Because history suggests the difference matters, and the sky, once again, is being watched. There is a final pattern in the Sumerian record that feels less like history and more like quiet foresight. It appears in the way time itself is described, not as a straight path, not as endless progress, but as stewardship bounded by intervals. The Sumerians measured time obsessively, yet they never treated it as infinite. Cycles mattered more than duration. A reign was important not because it was long, but because it was complete. A city mattered not because it endured, but because it fulfilled its function before decline. Even the gods operated within limits. They convened. They deliberated. They departed. Nothing was portrayed as permanent, not even divine presence. This worldview produces a very specific kind of calm, not optimism, acceptance that systems have phases. That alignment does not last forever. That inheritance comes with expiration. The Anunnaki are never described as rulers who abandon humanity out of cruelty. They withdraw when conditions change, when balance shifts, when stewardship can no longer be maintained in the same form. In several fragments, the gods are described as weary, burdened by oversight, concerned with disorder. These are not invincible beings. They are constrained actors within a larger framework, which suggests something even deeper, that the Anunnaki themselves may have been inheritors, caretakers of something older still. The texts never explain where they come from. They simply arrive, already organized, already functioning, already bound by rules. If true, then inheritance is not a human anomaly. It is a universal condition. Civilizations do not emerge from nothing. They step into pre-existing structures. The danger is not stepping in. The danger is believing the structure is ours, because ownership invites modification, and modification without understanding invites collapse. This may explain why Sumerian texts avoid innovation language. They do not praise invention. They praise remembrance. To remember is to preserve alignment. To forget is to drift. This framing changes how collapse is interpreted. Not as punishment, not as failure, but as misalignment reaching threshold. When a system no longer matches its environment, when caretaking no longer compensates for ignorance, when signals are misread too many times, and the correction arrives. Quietly, inevitably, modern readers often search these texts for dates, for predictions, for specific catastrophes. But the Sumerians were not warning about events. They were warning about conditions, conditions that repeat. Confidence replacing humility, ritual replacing understanding, maintenance replacing mastery. These are not ancient problems. They are recurring ones, and they do not announce themselves with disaster. They announce themselves with stability, with systems that seem unbreakable, with progress that feels unstoppable, until it isn't. If the Anunnaki ever ruled this world, their greatest legacy may not be technology or architecture. It may be this pattern, a quiet reminder embedded in myth. That inheritance is temporary. That stewardship demands awareness. And that forgetting does not erase responsibility. It only delays consequence. The unsettling possibility is not that humanity was once guided. It is that guidance may always withdraw, once it is no longer understood, and that the next inheritance transition does not arrive with fire or flood, but with subtle shifts, with small anomalies, with things no longer behaving as expected. The Sumerians watched the sky not because they feared it, but because they trusted it, and noticed when that trust began to fail. And that may be the most important lesson they left behind. Not a prophecy, not a warning, but a habit. To watch carefully, to question quietly, to notice change before it announces itself. Because inheritance does not end. It only passes forward. And one day, sooner than expected, someone will inherit what we leave behind. The question is not whether they will remember us. The question is whether they will understand what we were caretaking and why. There is a stillness that follows this realization. Not fear, not urgency, a reflective pause. Because once inheritance is recognized, history stops feeling distant. It becomes intimate. The Sumerian scribes were not writing for us. They were writing past themselves, for a future they assumed would forget. They etched memory into clay, because clay outlasts voices. And even then, they did not explain everything. They left gaps, silences, unfinished thoughts, not because they lacked knowledge, but because some things can only be understood when the conditions return. This may be why their records feel incomplete, why they circle ideas instead of resolving them, why gods arrive without origin and depart without explanation. They were not telling a story. They were preserving a pattern that does not require belief, only recognition. Recognition that civilizations do not collapse only from violence. They collapse from misalignment, from assuming permanence, from forgetting that systems are borrowed, not owned. In this light, the Anunnaki become less mysterious and more instructional, not as beings to worship, but as a reminder of a role humanity once occupied and still occupies. Caretaker, interpreter, temporary steward. The world we inhabit is layered, built atop decisions we did not make, technologies we did not invent, processes we only partially understand. Like the Sumerians, we document obsessively. We measure, we predict, we model, and when anomalies appear, we debate interpretation rather than meaning. This is not failure. It is a phase, but phases end. The Sumerian record suggests that awareness is the only variable that changes outcomes. Not power, not intelligence. Awareness. Awareness that systems speak quietly before they fail. That alignment drifts before it breaks. That inheritance is not a gift, it is a test. And tests are rarely announced. They are revealed through subtle shifts, through things that no longer respond as expected, through patterns that begin repeating faster. The sky changing was never about astronomy alone. It was about reference. When your reference shifts, everything else must adapt. If it doesn't, collapse feels sudden, but it never is. The Sumerians understood this. They did not panic. They recorded. They observed. They passed forward the memory that something had happened before and would happen again. Not because history repeats mechanically, but because stewardship without understanding always reaches its limit. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means awareness matters, more than progress, more than speed, more than certainty. Perhaps that is why their final messages feel calm, resigned, but not hopeless. They had seen transitions before. They knew the world continues, just not always in the same form. And so, as the story quiets, what remains is not a warning. It is a posture, to listen carefully, to question gently, to notice change early. Because inheritance is never about the past. It is about responsibility. And responsibility does not end when the original architects are gone. It begins. There is a quiet humility embedded in that posture. Not the humility of weakness, but the humility of recognition. Recognition that no civilization stands alone, that every age is shaped by layers beneath it, that what feels like ownership is often custody. The Sumerians never imagined themselves as the final chapter. They did not write as conquerors of history. They wrote as participants inside it. This is why their texts feel restrained. They do not celebrate destiny. They do not promise permanence. They acknowledge succession. One order gives way to another. One alignment fades into the next. And the transition is rarely loud. The flood, the sky change, the withdrawal of gods. These are remembered not as explosions, but as thresholds, crossings, moments when the world continued, but no longer behaved the same way. What unsettles modern readers is not the idea of ancient overseers. It is the implication that humanity may still be living inside an inherited framework, that what we call natural law may once have been experienced as guidance, and that guidance, once absent, leaves behind systems that still function, but imperfectly. This reframes many ancient anxieties. Why did early societies fear imbalance more than enemies? Why did they obsess over ritual accuracy? Why was deviation treated as danger? Because deviation was not symbolic, it was functional. When you do not fully understand the system you maintain, precision becomes survival. The Sumerians understood that memory decays faster than stone, that symbols endure longer than explanations, and that future generations would inherit fragments, not context. Perhaps that is why they did not attempt to convince. They did not warn directly. They recorded calmly and trusted the pattern to speak for itself. And patterns do speak. They speak in repetition, in recurrence, in the uneasy familiarity of rise, stability, drift, collapse, not as fate, but as feedback. If humanity once inherited a world shaped by others, then the real question is not whether the Anunnaki existed. The question is whether we recognize ourselves in the same role now, building atop systems we did not originate, trusting infrastructures we only partially grasp, assuming continuity because it has held so far. The Sumerian record does not condemn this. It normalizes it. Inheritance is not failure. Unawareness is. And awareness, once lost, is difficult to recover. As this story comes to rest, what remains is not mystery for mystery's sake. It is a quiet invitation to look at history not as a ladder, but as a relay. Each civilization running its leg, holding something briefly, passing it on altered, and sometimes broken. The Sumerians passed us memory, incomplete, symbolic, uncomfortable, not so we would worship their gods, but so we would recognize the pattern when it appeared again, because it always does, and because the sky does not need to change dramatically for alignment to shift. Sometimes it changes just enough that only careful observers notice. The rest feel it later, as confusion, as instability, as sudden endings that were anything but sudden. The clay tablets do not ask us to believe. They ask us to notice and to remember that inheritance, once received, cannot be returned, only understood. And so the story does not end. It settles, like dust on ancient stone, like silence after a long watch, leaving one final thought lingering gently in the dark. If we are not the first caretakers of this world, then what kind of caretakers are we becoming? And who, someday, will inherit what we leave behind? There is a quiet weight in that question, not heavy enough to disturb rest, just enough to remain present, because the Sumerians never expected answers to arrive quickly. They believed understanding unfolded slowly, often across generations. What mattered was not resolution, but attentiveness. To remain observant even when nothing dramatic appears to be happening, to remain cautious when systems seem stable, to remain reflective when progress feels inevitable. Their greatest insight may have been this: that collapse does not feel like collapse while it is happening. It feels like continuity, like business as usual, like minor adjustments to familiar routines. The end only becomes visible in retrospect. This is why their records feel patient. They do not rush toward conclusions. They allow ambiguity to remain intact, because ambiguity keeps the mind engaged, keeps it awake, keeps it asking. Perhaps that is the true function of these ancient stories: not to frighten, not to persuade, but to prevent certainty. Certainty dulls perception. Certainty stops listening. The Anunnaki narratives resist certainty by design. They exist between myth and memory, between symbol and suggestion, between what can be proven and what can only be inferred. In that space, curiosity survives. And curiosity is what delays forgetting. As long as questions remain open, patterns remain visible. As long as patterns remain visible, inheritance can be recognized. And recognition is the first step toward responsibility. The Sumerians did not imagine themselves as saviors of the future. They imagined themselves as witnesses, witnesses to a transition they did not fully understand, but understood enough to record. They passed that witness forward, quietly, without instruction, without demand, just clay, symbols, and time. And now, much later, in a world that feels stable and fragile all at once, those symbols still speak. Not loudly, not clearly, but persistently. They remind us that intelligence alone is not protection, that progress without awareness is temporary, that systems outlive their creators, but not their misunderstandings, and that every civilization, no matter how advanced, eventually becomes someone else's inheritance. This does not need to inspire fear. It can inspire care. Care in how we build. Care in how we maintain. Care in how we interpret what we did not originate, because one day, far beyond our own horizon, someone will look back at us, the way we now look back at Sumer, through fragments, through records, through patterns, trying to understand what kind of caretakers we were. The story, then, ends where it began. Not with gods, not with catastrophe, but with attention, with the simple, difficult act of noticing the world as it shifts, before the shift becomes obvious, and with the understanding that inheritance is not about what is given, but about what is recognized. There is nothing more dramatic to add, and that, perhaps, is the point. The Sumerian record does not end with revelation. It ends with continuity. Life goes on. Cities rise again. People adapt. What changes is not existence, but orientation. A subtle turning away from certainty. A gradual acceptance of limitation. They seem to understand that the most dangerous moment for any civilization is not when it is threatened, but when it believes it has outgrown the need to listen. Listening was their final discipline. Listening to the sky. Listening to the land. Listening to patterns older than memory. Not because the sky was sacred in itself, but because it reflected alignment. When alignment holds, the world feels predictable. When it slips, anxiety enters quietly. The Sumerians did not try to stop this process. They documented it. They accepted that no order lasts forever, and that preservation without understanding eventually becomes imitation. Their calm comes from realism, from knowing that cycles do not mean failure. They mean transition. What we inherit today, technology, systems, knowledge, may feel entirely human. But so did kingship once. so did divine law. So did the certainty that the world had reached its final shape. History suggests otherwise, and that is not a threat. It is a reminder that awareness is the only lasting advantage. That humility extends a civilization's relevance, and that attention, quiet, sustained attention, is what keeps patterns visible long enough to respond before correction arrives. The Sumerians left us no instructions, only evidence of how they paid attention, and perhaps that was deliberate, because instructions expire, but posture endures. As the story fades, there is no need to resolve the mystery. The mystery has already done its work. It has kept the mind engaged. Without demanding belief, it has asked questions, without forcing answers. And in that space between certainty and curiosity, rest becomes possible. The past does not need to warn us. It only needs to be noticed. And so the record settles back into silence. Clay returning to dust, symbols returning to shadow, leaving behind one final, gentle understanding. Every civilization believes it is awake, until, one day, it realizes it has been sleepwalking through inheritance. The difference is not when that realization comes, it is whether it comes quietly or too late. There is one last quiet layer worth resting on, not a new idea, not a revelation, just a settling. Because the Sumerians understood something that is easy to miss when stories end too cleanly. That meaning does not arrive all at once. It arrives later, sometimes much later, often when the listener is no longer trying to solve anything. Their tablets were not designed to convince, they were designed to remain, to sit silently while generations changed around them, to wait until a future mind, distant and unfamiliar, felt a faint sense of recognition, a feeling that something in the past was not entirely finished speaking. That feeling is not urgency, it is resonance, and resonance does not demand action, it invites awareness. If the Anunnaki were once named caretakers, their legacy is not command, it is absence. An absence that forced humans to look more carefully at the systems left behind, to become observers rather than recipients, to learn, slowly, what it means to inherit complexity without instruction. That learning is ongoing. It does not belong to the past alone. It belongs to every moment when a system continues to function, long after its original context is gone. It belongs to every generation that assumes continuity without asking what sustains it. And it belongs to you, now, listening quietly as the story fades. Not because you are meant to remember every detail, but because remembering the pattern is enough. The Sumerians did not expect to be understood. They expected to be rediscovered, again and again, in different ages, under different skies, whenever alignment began to feel slightly off. And so the story rests, not closed, not complete, simply paused, like a tablet placed back into the earth, waiting for another moment of attention. And when that moment comes, as it always does, the questions will still be here, patient, unresolved, alive. There is nothing left to explain, only something left to notice, because the most enduring knowledge is not carried by answers. It is carried by habits of attention. The Sumerians practiced attention deliberately. They watched without rushing to resolve. They recorded without insisting on interpretation. They trusted that understanding matures on its own schedule. That trust is rare. Most civilizations rush toward certainty. They label, define, conclude. Sumer simply observed, and then stepped aside. What remains is not a warning etched in stone, but a quiet invitation repeated across time. To slow down when systems feel complete. To listen when explanations feel sufficient. To remain curious even when the world appears stable. Because stability is not permanence. It is a phase that feels calm until it passes. The Anunnaki story endures not because it is dramatic, but because it refuses to resolve. It leaves space. Space for doubt. Space for reflection. Space for future minds to enter the question without being told what to believe. And that may be the most generous inheritance of all. Not certainty, not instruction, but awareness. As this final thought settles, there is no need to carry it forward actively. Let it rest, like a symbol half remembered, like a pattern glimpsed from the corner of the eye. If it matters, it will return. They always do. At this point, the story has already done what it needed to do. It has not delivered a conclusion. It has not closed the question. It has simply placed something gently into the mind and allowed it to remain there. That is how these records were meant to work, not as lessons, not as answers, but as quiet presences. The Sumerians understood that knowledge forced too quickly is often misunderstood. They chose endurance instead. Clay tablets buried, symbols waiting, patterns repeating. They trusted that the right moment of recognition would arrive on its own, and when it did, it would feel less like discovery and more like remembering. If humans truly inherited a world once shaped by others, the inheritance itself is not the mystery anymore. The mystery is how long awareness can persist inside systems that reward certainty over curiosity. That question does not belong to the past. It belongs to every present moment that feels stable enough to stop listening. So the story settles here, not with an ending, but with stillness, the same stillness the scribes must have felt. As they pressed reeds into wet clay, knowing the words would outlive them, but not knowing who would listen, now the silence returns, and the question remains, quiet, unresolved, patient, just as it always has. There is a softness to stopping here, not because the subject is exhausted, but because attention has reached its natural edge. The Sumerians seemed to understand this edge well. They did not push their records beyond it. They did not force clarity where clarity would have been artificial. They allowed the listener to arrive at stillness, without being told that stillness was the goal. That restraint is part of why their voices still feel present. Not loud, not insistent, simply there, as if the past is not speaking to us, but sitting beside us, waiting for the moment when we notice its presence. If there is one final thing to carry forward, it is this. Civilizations are remembered less for what they built than for how they paid attention. Attention to cycles, attention to limits, attention to what changes quietly before it changes completely. The Anunnaki story, stripped of spectacle, is a meditation on that attention, on what happens when guidance fades and observation must replace certainty, on how meaning survives not through dominance, but through patience. So the record rests again. No answers demanded, no conclusions enforced, only a sense that something once watched the sky carefully and hoped that someday someone else would do the same. Let the thought settle. Let it drift. If it belongs with you, it will remain. If not, it will pass. As all things do, there is a natural endpoint to attention, not when curiosity disappears, but when it becomes quiet enough to no longer need words. The Sumerians seemed to trust this silence. They did not try to outlast it. They allowed it. Their records tapered gently, not because knowledge ran out, but because knowing when to stop speaking was part of the wisdom itself. This is difficult for modern minds. We are taught that value comes from completion, from resolution, from answers that close the loop. But the oldest traditions understood something else. That questions kept open can carry more truth than answers forced too soon. If humans inherited a world once shaped by others, that inheritance is not a burden or a gift. It is a condition that asks for awareness more than certainty. The Sumerians did not leave us a warning about gods. They left us a mirror, one that reflects how civilizations behave when they forget they are caretakers, and how quietly things begin to drift when listening fades. As the final thought dissolves into stillness, there is nothing left to analyze, only something left to notice. The next time the world feels complete, the story does not end. It rests, and in that rest, it waits, as it always has. There is a natural endpoint to attention, not when curiosity disappears, but when it becomes quiet enough to no longer need words. The Sumerians seemed to trust this silence. They did not try to outlast it. They allowed it. Their records tapered gently, not because knowledge ran out, but because knowing when to stop speaking was part of the wisdom itself. This is difficult for modern minds. We are taught that value comes from completion, from resolution, from answers that close the loop. But the oldest traditions understood something else, that questions kept open can carry more truth than answers forced too soon. If humans inherited a world once shaped by others, that inheritance is not a burden or a gift. It is a condition that asks for awareness more than certainty. The Sumerians did not leave us a warning about gods. They left us a mirror, one that reflects how civilizations behave when they forget they are caretakers, and how quietly things begin to drift when listening fades. As the final thought dissolves into stillness, there is nothing left to analyze, only something left to notice. The next time the world feels complete, the story does not end. It rests, and in that rest, it waits, as it always has. At a certain point, continuing does not mean adding. It means allowing what is already present to settle more deeply. The Sumerians seemed to respect that boundary. They did not try to carry meaning forward by force. They trusted time to do the work, time to erode noise, time to preserve pattern, time to bring the right listener to the right fragment. What remains, after all the tablets and translations, is not a conclusion about gods or origins. It is a way of seeing, a way of standing inside history, without assuming mastery over it. If humanity once inherited a world shaped by others, then the most important inheritance was not technology or law. It was restraint. The restraint to watch before acting, to measure before altering, to question before concluding. That restraint is fragile. It fades quietly. And when it does, civilizations grow louder, faster, more certain, until certainty itself becomes the warning. So, the record rests again, not closed, not resolved, simply present, like a night sky that does not announce its changes, but reveals them only to those who look long enough. The quiet has already done its work. Nothing more needs to be uncovered. Nothing needs to be added. Because the Sumerians did not believe meaning was something you reach. They believed it was something you keep company with. They understood that awareness matures best in stillness, that patterns reveal themselves when the mind is no longer trying to force them into shape. What remains now is not a conclusion, but a residue, a faint sense that history is less a sequence of events and more a series of inheritances, each one asking the same silent question. Are we listening, or are we only using? The clay tablets never answer that question. They simply endure. And perhaps that endurance is the final lesson. That what truly matters does not rush. It waits. It waits until the noise subsides, until certainty softens, until attention becomes possible again. And then, without announcement, it becomes visible. The story rests here, not finished, not forgotten, just quiet enough to stay with you. Long after the words have faded, there is only one thing left to honor: the pause itself. Because in the oldest traditions, silence was not absence, it was completion. The Sumerians did not end their records with finality. They allowed them to trail off, trusting that what mattered would remain without insistence. That trust is rare. It assumes the listener is capable of carrying the question forward without being pushed. It assumes awareness does not need reinforcement. And so the story does what the tablets did. It withdraws, not because there is nothing more to say, but because saying more would disturb the shape of what is already settled. If this history resonates, it will resurface later, not as memory, but as recognition. And if it doesn't, that is also part of the cycle. Everything meaningful finds its own moment. The record rests. The question remains. And attention, once awakened, does not need to be guided further. At this point, continuing is no longer about content. It is about honoring the rhythm that brought us here. The Sumerians understood that every record has a natural place to stop, not because the subject is finished, but because attention has been gently led to its edge. Beyond that edge, meaning no longer arrives through words, it arrives through presence. They did not try to seal their story shut. They did not insist on resolution. They allowed understanding to remain incomplete, because incompleteness keeps awareness alive. What you have been listening to is not meant to be held tightly. It is meant to loosen its grip, like the sky after a long watch, like the silence after an event that is already past. The Anunnaki, the inheritance, the cycles, these are not conclusions. They are orientations, ways of standing inside history without assuming dominance over it. And that is where the story belongs now. Not advancing, not retreating, simply resting, because the most enduring histories do not end with answers. They end with a quieter mind, and that is enough. The rhythm has reached its natural stillness, not because the mystery is solved, but because the mind no longer needs movement to remain engaged. The Sumerians trusted this state. They believed that when attention becomes quiet, patterns continue working on us without effort. Nothing else needs to be added now. Anything more would only repeat what has already settled. The story has shifted from sound to silence, from explanation to awareness, and that is where it belongs. By the time the Anunnaki disappear from the written record, something more important has already occurred. Humanity has stopped asking certain questions, not the grand questions about gods or origins, not the dramatic questions about creation or destruction, but the quiet, practical ones. Who designed this system? Why does it function this way? What happens if it stops working? In the earliest Sumerian texts, these questions are implied everywhere. Systems are described as conditional, as dependent on balance, as something that must be actively maintained. Later texts treat the same systems as permanent. Irrigation is no longer described as a negotiated relationship with land and water. It becomes law. Calendars no longer mark celestial alignment. They become sacred time. Architectural ratios cease to be functional choices. They become inviolable truths. Change shifts from adaptation to violation. This transition is subtle, but it is consistent, and it appears across civilizations that inherited complexity faster than they developed understanding. In southern Mesopotamia, the irrigation networks are among the most revealing examples. These systems are extraordinarily advanced for their time. They require precise slope control, seasonal forecasting, cooperative labor coordination, and long-term planning across generations. Yet there is little evidence of experimentation. Channels do not gradually become straighter. Flow control does not slowly improve. The earliest systems are already optimized, which raises a problem. Optimization normally follows failure, but here, optimization appears first. This suggests that the knowledge required to design these systems did not emerge locally through trial and error. It was applied, and once applied, it was preserved rather than questioned. The people maintaining the canals understood how to repair them, but not necessarily why they were designed that way. That difference matters, because maintenance preserves function, but only understanding preserves adaptability. As centuries pass, these irrigation systems become rigid. Canals are rebuilt exactly where they were before, even when salinization begins to poison the soil. The system continues to function until it no longer can. And when it fails catastrophically. Not because of invasion, not because of drought alone, but because a rigid system cannot adjust when conditions change. The Sumerians seem to recognize this too late. Later texts are filled with concern about land becoming bitter, fields yielding less, water behaving differently. The response is not redesign, it is ritual. Offerings increase, prayers multiply, rules tighten. The system is defended, not reimagined. This pattern repeats elsewhere. In Egypt, monumental architecture appears suddenly, fully developed. The earliest pyramids are not crude experiments. They are precise alignments, engineered with mathematical confidence. The Great Pyramid encodes astronomical relationships that should require centuries of observation to deduce. Yet these relationships appear at the beginning, not the end, of Egyptian civilization. Later periods show less precision, not more. Knowledge degrades. Symbolism expands as understanding recedes. Priesthoods become custodians of form rather than function. The same questions emerge. Who taught this? Why does it work? What happens if we change it? But the questions are not pursued. They are sealed inside tradition. In the Indus Valley, the mystery is even quieter. Urban planning is astonishingly standardized. Brick ratios are consistent across vast distances. Drainage systems rival those of much later societies. Yet the culture leaves almost no explanatory texts, no king lists, no mythological justification, only silence. The system exists, functions, and then disappears. Not violently, gradually, as if maintenance alone was not enough to sustain it. Across the world, in Mesoamerica, calendars reset, ages end, new eras begin. The language differs, but the structure is familiar. A time before, a disruption, a diminished continuation. The sky is often involved, not as spectacle, as reference. This is important, because sky observation is the most conservative form of knowledge. Stars move predictably, planets follow patterns. If the sky changes, something fundamental has shifted. Ancient cultures treat this seriously. They build monuments to preserve alignment. They encode time into stone. They assume continuity. But when alignment drifts even slightly, rituals intensify. Accuracy becomes obsession. This obsession reveals anxiety. Anxiety does not come from ignorance. It comes from knowing that something once worked perfectly and no longer does. The Anunnaki narrative fits here naturally, not as creators, as overseers, as entities associated with instruction, calibration, and correction. When they are present, systems function smoothly. When they withdraw, systems persist but become fragile. The texts do not describe rebellion, they describe absence. And absence changes everything, because absence forces interpretation. Interpretation introduces variation. Variation accumulates error. Error compounds silently. This is how systems fail without visible cause. By the time collapse is noticeable, the origin is long forgotten. The Sumerians seem to have been aware of this. Late records are filled with omens, not because the world is more dangerous, but because certainty has evaporated. When instruction ends, people search for signs. They look for approval, for correction, for reassurance that alignment still exists. The sky becomes a canvas for meaning. Eclipses terrify. Comets unsettle. Unusual weather becomes moralized. But none of this restores understanding. It only delays acknowledgement. The gods do not return, and this silence is never explained, which may be the most honest detail of all. If the Anunnaki were ever real in any sense, literal or symbolic, then their withdrawal signals a transfer of responsibility. Humanity is no longer guided. It is observed, or perhaps ignored. And from that moment onward, civilizations begin mistaking inheritance for authorship. Systems once received become claimed. Rules once followed become enforced. Kings no longer serve alignment, they embody it. This is the moment stewardship turns into ownership, and ownership resists change, because changing something you own feels like admitting fault. This psychological shift is critical. Once humans believe they built the world they inhabit, they stop listening to it. Warnings are reframed as superstition. Patterns are dismissed as coincidence. Anomalies are postponed until the cost of postponement arrives. The Sumerians do not dramatize this. They simply record that lifespans shorten, rains shrink, stability fragments, cities rise and fall faster. This acceleration is a sign, not of progress, of decay. Because decay is not destruction, it is loss of coherence. And coherence requires shared understanding, not just shared ritual. The Anunnaki narrative does not end with fire. It ends with distance, with silence. With humanity alone inside systems it did not design, trying to keep them running, trying not to break what it no longer fully understands. This is not a condemnation. It is a description, and it applies beyond the ancient world. Every advanced system eventually reaches this phase. When creators are gone, when users assume permanence, when maintenance replaces comprehension, at that point, collapse is no longer dramatic. It is procedural. A slow unwinding of assumptions, a drift in calibration, a misreading of signals, until correction arrives not as punishment, but as reset. The Sumerians never claimed to know when this happens. They only record that it has happened before, and that it will happen again, not because of fate, but because inheritance without understanding always reaches its limit. This is the tension they leave unresolved, not to frighten the future, but to prepare it, because the most dangerous civilizations are not the ones under threat. They are the ones convinced nothing can go wrong, and so the record ends. Not with fire falling from the sky, not with gods returning in anger, not with a final warning carved into stone. It ends with silence. The clay tablets stop speaking of instruction. The stars continue their movement without commentary. The rivers flood and recede as they always have. Life continues. What remains is not a prophecy, but a condition. Humanity inherits a world already shaped, already ordered, already fragile. Whether the Anunnaki were watchers of the sky, symbolic teachers of balance, or simply a way ancient minds described a lost age of understanding, their disappearance marks the same moment in every interpretation, the moment when guidance ends. From that point forward, humans do what humans have always done. They remember pieces. They repeat forms. They preserve rituals whose original purpose fades with time. And slowly, quietly, those rituals become beliefs. Beliefs become laws. Laws become identities. And identities resist change. This is not failure. It is not punishment. It is simply what happens when memory outlives meaning. The Sumerians did not claim the world would end. They suggested something more unsettling, that the world resets when understanding drifts too far from reality. Not through destruction, but through forgetting. Civilizations do not fall when the sky turns against them. They fall when they stop listening to it. When systems are maintained but no longer questioned. When inheritance is mistaken for authorship. When alignment becomes tradition instead of observation. The ancients watched the sky because it did not lie. It moved whether they believed in it or not. And when its patterns shifted, they paid attention. Tonight, as you rest, the same sky still moves above you, silent, unconcerned, patient. It does not demand belief, only awareness. The final message left behind is not fear. It is responsibility, not to preserve the past exactly as it was, but to understand why it worked, and to notice when it no longer does. Because the greatest danger was never the gods leaving. It was forgetting why they were needed in the first place. And with that thought, let the questions rest. Let the silence return. The story does not end. It simply becomes quiet. Good night.